We're ready, Comrade.
Go.
Good morning, everybody. I think that we got a few people that have connected. We got a few other people that are trying. I would like to welcome you all. My name is Vinny Molina. I'm joining you from Perth. I'm the president of the Communist Party of Australia and also the convener for Worker Solidarity WI. I would like to welcome you all, acknowledging that they're joining you from the stolen lands of the Noongar people. I acknowledge also that sovereignty was never ceded. It always was, and it always will be Aboriginal land. I would like firstly to thank the speakers. We got local and international speakers this morning for us, and late night for our comrades from Venezuela, and also to our comrade Zach, who is assisting us on the technical side. Thank you, Zach, for making this possible. This event is being recorded and also live streamed through the Worker Solidarity Facebook page. So technology has allowed us to have this type of events. The pandemic has really have an impact on the way we do activity in the solidarity sense for people on the left. However, we also have taken advantage of technology to join our people around the world in solidarity with the causes that we fight for. In this instance, this morning for us here in Australia, we're standing in solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. We remember the fight of Simon Bolivar that Hugo Chavez followed and put in practice during the second independence. I also would like to take a minute to remember an event on 26th of July, 1953. That was the spark of the Cuban Revolution, only 90 miles from the United States in the Americas, the Cuban Socialist Revolution that we're gonna celebrate tomorrow here in Australia through the Australia-Cuba Friendship Society and other solidarity groups. But it is a good moment in history to stand against the aggressions on Venezuela by US imperialism. All these attacks I see on the sanctions, on the oil ships, the economic sanctions that kill people, the acts of war, and we must stand against this. The stolen gold by the Bank of England and other assets that belong to the Venezuelan people. All that must stop. And we, around the world, that stand for dignity, we stand for independence, and we stand for socialism. We must try to do whatever we can to make people aware of what it is happening today against the people of Venezuela, against the revolution. And the pandemic has shown us how socialist countries around the world have dealt with the pandemic in a better way than capitalism. Capitalism has shown once more the failures of that system. Cuba had defeated strategically the pandemic. But economic sanctions are there, the blockade must be lifted, and that we must rally for the end of this criminal blockade. The sanctions on Venezuela and other countries like Iran, the DPRK, all of that must end. On behalf of Worker Solidarity WI and the Communist Party of Australia, I would like to thank the speakers for making this effort and joining us, in particular, the comrade Carolus, who is there at night, but it would be very important to talk about defending the revolution while deepening the socialist revolution in Venezuela, and to hear the perspective from the Communist Party of Venezuela. To this end, I would like people to turn your mics off unless you're speaking, so we don't have any interference, any back feed there for the recording. And just to keep it on when you're talking. And I would like to invite the head of the Venezuelan mission in Canberra, Daniel Gaspari, to introduce our comrade Carolus and to welcome him, and also to give the perspective from the Venezuelan embassy, where we have been working very close together in this type of events and trying to strengthen the solidarity movement with Venezuela in Australia. So I would like to invite Daniel now to introduce Carolus, and you have the floor, Daniel. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much to all of you, for people from all over the world. I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the workers of Western Australia and the Communist Party of Australia for organizing this virtual event. Bini, please, thanks from us, from the people of Venezuela, from the people of the world. Thank you for all your effort that you do, you and the Communist Party does for Venezuela. Well, yesterday, you know, we commemorate the anniversary of our national hero, Simón Bolívar, who liberated 5 countries of Latin America. And of course, that includes Venezuela. It's a great honor for me today to present our comrade Carolus Wiemer. He's the president of COSI, which is the International Solidarity Committee, very important committee who's working with people all around the world in order to build a strong solidarity with Venezuela. Also, he's the Secretary General from the Communist Party of Venezuela, and very well known because he was the former president of the Latin American Parliament some years ago. It was an honor to meet Carolus many years ago when the revolution started. He was working in the National Assembly, and we joined that work together. Thank you, Carolus, for being with us today. We appreciate a lot your effort. I know that's late for you there, but we appreciate your presence and support that you can give to this event and to the people from Australia to know from a second hand, which is not always the same people, you know, what's the reality of what's happening in Venezuela. Thanks a lot. So I leave the floor to Carolus. Thank you very much to all of you to be here today. I see many good faces, but I'm not going to name it today because it's going to be a large conversation. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Carolus.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Comrade Carolus, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Good morning in Australia. I thank for the invitation from that Comrade Vinnie Molina, the president of the Communist Party of Australia, sent to me. We are very glad to be here, to know new comrades, new friends. And as Comrade Vinnie said, it's a new opportunity. Former times we said that we must wait 1 year, 2 years, 3 years to visit Australia, to can speak together. And now with the new technology and also with this new situation, we can use it every day we want. For that, thank you very much, Comrade Vinnie. On behalf of the Politburo of the Communist Party of Venezuela, I deliver solidarity and revolutionary greetings. I'm the International Secretary of the Communist Party of Venezuela. The Communist Party of Australia is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. Congratulations. It's a special year for you. And I would like to greet my comrades here, my new friends from Australia, from New Zealand, and from other countries in the world. Likewise, everyone who takes part in this video conference. Let us update the information about Venezuela. This is generally misrepresented in the bourgeois press. It all started 22 years ago when Commander Hugo Chavez was a presidential candidate. It was a great hope of the people, workers, peasants, women, indigenous people, and youth. The US feared that it could lose control of the country with the largest oil reserves. In this time, Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, repeated, "We will not allow Hugo Chavez to win the elections. This is a democracy of the United States. We will not allow Hugo Chavez to win the elections." That was in 1998. Hugo Chavez won the election. He became a democratically elected president, and the national liberation struggle began. But since then, the United States, accompanied by the European Union and ultra-right Latin America, have been trying to occupy Venezuela politically, economically, and militarily. The US has largely lost the struggle so far, but they did a lot of damage with their criminal policies, material damage and human damage, and an outrageous violation of human rights that, according to the United Nations, has claimed around 40,000 lives and over $120 billion in material damage. And these are not coronavirus deaths, but people, mainly children, who because of the blockade and the economic and financial sanctions do not have enough to eat and cannot get the necessary vaccines and medicines. Now, about the present time. There will be a new parliamentary election in December, and Venezuelans communists are preparing for a hot election campaign. The die is cast. In the 17th plenary session of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Venezuela, it decided to participate in the election on December 6th. In the first place, there will be internal party discussion about the election program and the possible candidates of the CPV. At the same time, talks are being held with national and regional parties and groups of voters to implement the agreed line of a popular and revolutionary alternative alliance. Popular and Revolutionary Alternative Alliance. Candidates and lists must be submitted between August 10th and 19th, and the campaign will run from November 21st to December 6th. On the CPV's long-standing struggle, there are important changes in the standards of the National Electoral Council and in the number of elected representatives in this year's parliamentary election. Everything in total conformity with the Constitution. For the legislative period 2021 to 2026, 277 members are elected, 110 more than before. Of the 277 parliamentarians, 48 are elected for the first time from a nationwide list, and the rest in the 87 constituencies, including the representatives of the indigenous people. In Venezuela, there is a census of original and current indigenous people that marks the figure of 44 ethnic groups, each with its language, its uses and traditions, its racial peculiarities. They represent 2.2% of the Venezuelan population. A little more than a third lives in the traditional communities, while the rest, that is 64%, in non-traditional places, urban and rural areas. With the help of the Supreme Court ruling, the CPV achieved new standards for greater proportional representation in Parliament to safeguard the right of minorities. According to the National Electoral Council, 28 national political organizations, 52 regional parties, and 6 indigenous organizations are currently admitted to the December elections. This is our form to decide in democracy. The Political Bureau of the CPV assures against false reports that this election campaign is not being conducted alone or against the Socialist Government Party. No, but the Communist Party of Venezuela will appear with its own class-oriented profile, which will serve as a mouthpiece for the interests of the working class and the peasant class, and ultimately for the entire wage-dependent population in parliament. The realization of common lists and candidates will depend, on one hand, on the program items reached, but on the other hand, also on the regional balance of power against the ultra-right fascist opposition. We will not give an inch to the imperialist forces. The interaction of tactical and strategic questions plays a role that is not easy to solve. Though the Communist Party will continue to work toward a broad anti-imperialist and anti-fascist alliance, but will also clearly differentiate itself from reformist groups who are seeking salvation from the capitalist economic crisis in negotiations with the United States and the increasing influence of old and new monopolies, and not as the CPV demands in the increasing government participation of workers, peasants, and wage earners. The election next December are not only of national interest. Both the United States and Europe do not recognize elections and election results from the outset. Once again, never they accepted, never they recognized the election results since 1998. While the European Union Foreign Policy Representative Josep Borrell told, "I'm deeply concerned about the increasing use of the threat of sanction by the United States against European businesses and interests." He advocated criminal sanction against Venezuela, against Cuba, against Nicaragua, which bring immense suffering to the population. The national and international class enemy is delighted when Donald Trump, the United Kingdom, and the Portuguese are involved in the theft of Venezuelan assets, when the Venezuelan Citgo refinery and several Venezuelan companies in Colombia are illegally expropriated by the United States, and when several billions of US dollars of the Venezuelan state are hijacked by English and Portuguese banks. But we will overcome. We have successfully resisted for 22 years, and we will continue to fight. Our struggle has 3 strengths. First, the anti-imperialist and patriotic consciousness of the people. Second, the civil military unity. And third, the international solidarity. We thank the Communist Party of Australia, the trade unions, the indigenous movements, the peace organizations who fight with us and who show solidarity with our fight. Without the international solidarity, we don't know what would have happened. Everything speaks for exciting moments of this class struggle in Venezuela in the next few months. Many thanks.
Thank you, Comrade Carolus, for that intervention and putting the Communist Party of Venezuela in position. I also recall when you pay a visit to Australia a couple of times, and we welcome you in Western Australia and taking you to construction sites, addressing workers, and be welcome by workers in the construction industry. Was very, very interesting, the reaction and the solidarity expressed by workers during your visit, and hopefully we will be able to organize that visit that we have been planning for a few years now. In the near future, we might be able to materialize. In the meantime, the Zoom allow us to do this. I remind people it's being recorded and broadcasting live on the Workers' Solidarity Facebook page. There will be questions and answers at the end of the speakers, so people can start posting their questions on the chat or put it live. The next speaker is Dr. Rodrigo Acuña. He is a teacher and an expert on Latin American politics. He has a Bachelor of Arts, honors in politics and international relations in Spanish Latin American Studies from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, as well as a diploma in education from the same institution. In 2013, he completed a PhD on Venezuelan foreign policy after having been awarded an Australian postgraduate award by the federal government. Rodrigo has published in numerous media and academic outlets. He has been interviewed by several sources on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, SBS, radio in Spanish, Al Jazeera, Sputnik, Radio Adelaide, Venezolana de Televisión, The Wire, and he currently works as an independent researcher and is also contributing editor at Alborada, Latin America Uncovered. So I would like to welcome Rodrigo. This time you will have more time, to about 20 minutes to do your presentation. Unfortunately, the last time we cut you short, but this time feel free to do your presentation. So thank you very much for accepting the invite, Rodrigo, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinny. I'll try and just talk for about 15 minutes. So if I do go over time, please feel free to interrupt me and let me know that I'm going over time. I guess I want to go back a little bit. I informed you that the purpose of my talk was going to be US foreign policy under the Trump administration towards Venezuela. And I think it's important because the Trump administration has, without a doubt, been the most aggressive towards Venezuela. And I think it's quite clear that the Trump administration is now short of a direct US military intervention, is attempting to use all means necessary to overthrow a very important political process in Latin America, which, despite all of its contradictions and internal problems, still has a noticeable amount of support. So if the Venezuelan government is overthrown and its supporters are persecuted, I would always like to remind those of the opposition, and especially people that are living in outside of Venezuela, who may have, who once living inside the country and are now openly siding with the opposition. Things are going to become very interesting because there are going to be a lot of political refugees, and in fact, a refugee crisis which is going to be created, a serious refugee crisis which is going to be created if the Trump administration and members of the opposition are successful in actually violently overthrowing the Bolivarian Revolution. Before I talk about the Trump administration, I think it's important to note that the United States was from the very beginning opposed to Hugo Chavez coming to power in 1999. President Clinton, in fact, first met Hugo Chavez. There was a lot of diplomatic pressure placed on Venezuela especially for the Venezuelan president not to visit Cuba. The Venezuelan president was quite outspoken that he was not going to support the US embargo on Cuba, that he was not going to support Colombia's war with the rebels and mass human rights violations that were taking place. The new administration in Caracas was going to support a peaceful resolution, a dialogue in Colombia, regional unification, a lifting of US sanctions on Cuba. So that resulted in Clinton not even wanting to meet publicly with Hugo Chavez. There was a meeting that took place, but that was behind closed doors. Soon, sanctions commenced, and the sanctions commenced in terms of the United States not supporting the sales of replacement parts for fighter jets in Venezuela. The fighter jets historically were the F-14s, purchased from the United States. Sorry, you're not getting your parts anymore, which effectively started to make those fighter planes ineffective. They weren't going to be used. If we fast forward to 2002, the Bush administration, of course, supported the 48-hour coup d'etat against President Hugo Chavez, who was kidnapped by a section of the military, the generals. It wasn't a coup d'etat which had widespread support amongst the population. It wasn't a coup d'etat that even had widespread support amongst the military. So that explains why the coup was overthrown, was reversed within 48 hours, once the majority of the military realized that President Chavez had not resigned. They looked for him, they rescued him. Millions of people came out onto the streets. It's important to note that the local media in Venezuela, the media in the United States, supported the coup. They repeated the lies of the opposition. They repeated the lies of the United States. And of course, the United States under the Bush administration recognized the new leaders in Venezuela, the coup d'etat leaders. And they eventually, some of the key figures eventually fled to Colombia and then to the United States. If we fast forward to then the Obama administration, the Obama administration, of course, intensified sanctions and declared Venezuela a threat to US national security. Now, the president of Uruguay at the time, Mujica, if I remember correctly, said that this was a joke. Venezuela did not pose a threat to the United States by any means, not a military threat, not an economic threat. But of course, of those of you who know a little bit about Latin American history, you would know that it posed a political threat, an ideological threat to its interest in throughout Latin America. US companies and the United States and its ambassadors, et cetera, have long had their way in Latin America. Their companies pay very little tax. Their ambassadors speak to Latin American presidents as they see fit. And apart from the competition that they're now getting from China, they historically have had basically their own way. And whenever progressive governments get to power in Latin America, the conservative ultra-right elite run to Washington, cry, the Reds have arrived, we need to overthrow them, and they usually historically have got their way. So Obama increased these sanctions. Obama began to target the Venezuelan state oil company, Citgo, and Citgo, it's called Citgo in the United States, PDVSA in Venezuela and throughout Latin America. And Chavez at the time understood that the gold reserves, there was a section of gold reserves that were held in London, needed to be moved out of the country. I was in Venezuela at the time. I've visited Venezuela on many occasions. I've been seeing the government's programs in health and education. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. And they realized, the Venezuelan government realized that these all gold reserves needed to be moved out of London. And the problem with the state oil company is that historically, when oil was nationalized in Venezuela in 1976, many of the refineries were actually located in the United States. Venezuela has heavy crude oil that needs to be refined. And while there are refineries within the country, some important refineries are outside of the country. And that was a way that that the nationalization did not hurt US interest. It was a process that took place back in the 1970s. If we fast forward to the Trump administration, of course, the Trump administration has imposed even harsher sanctions. And here we're talking about sanctions dealing with, for example, shipping companies. So if shipping companies move Venezuelan oil, then sanctions are then placed on those companies, on those ships, and they then cannot enter US harbors. These are companies that are not necessarily Venezuelan companies. These are companies that are not even US companies, although they certainly would come under the sanctions. These are third-party sanctions. So you do business with the Venezuelans, you're not going to be able to do business with us. That intensified under the Trump administration. Of course, bank loans. Bank loans is a major issue, or any sort of financial dealings with the country. We live in a society, in a global society where we're interconnected. So if you decide to put sanctions, financial, monetary sanctions on a country, before you know it, even PayPal doesn't want to do business in your country, because they are afraid that there will be repercussions by the United States. And this is, of course, this cannot be emphasized enough. If we go to the Allende government in the 1970s in Chile, there's a very good book that I always recommend to people called Allende's Chile, An Insider View by Edward Borstein. And I wish that someone in Venezuela would, if the book exists, please let me know what it's called. I'd be interested in seeing that work translated into English. I think it's very important that the Venezuelans communicate to the rest of the world the sanctions that are taking place against them, and specifically provide us with details, provide us with facts in terms of how these sanctions are actually working. If we continue with the story, with current developments under the Trump administration, in recent years, in 2009, the Center for Economic and Policy Research published a paper documenting the impact of sanctions in terms of medical supplies into the country. So it talked about approximately 40,000 people that have actually died in Venezuela due to a lack of medical supplies being able to enter the country, specifically because of US sanctions. According to the human rights lawyer and ex-secretary for the United Nations Human Rights Council, Alfred Maurice de Zayas, he tabled a report in late 2018. He submitted a report to the United Nations, and he came up with a figure of approximately 100,000 Venezuelans that have possibly died because of US economic sanctions. Now, he claims that report was submitted to the UN in late 2018, but of course it was completely ignored by the mainstream media. The mainstream media narrative is always that the Maduro administration's policies do not work, they're a failure, and that's really why the whole country, there are serious economic problems taking place in the country. Now, certainly there are problems that are taking place in the country, and certainly there are criticisms that can be made of the government. I think the government has switched in terms of its ministers and in terms of its policies in trying to deal with the crisis. But I don't think that is the key factor in terms of why this, why so many Venezuelans are leaving, why so many people are living under some very harsh conditions. I do think that it's a situation of the local business community hoarding products, engaging in an economic war against the government, and of course the United States actively supporting that through a trade embargo. Now, just to again continue with the Trump administration, according to the head of the Venezuelan delegation at the United Nations, recently, he claimed that approximately 3,000 US personnel are actually stationed in the US embassy in Bogota. That's an excessive number. Everyone knows that the United States has always a very large number of diplomats, in especially countries that they consider to be of strategic importance to them. But even for the US, that's a very large number. Now, earlier this year, of course, Silvercorp USA sort of became the laughing stock of the mercenary industry, did attempt to invade Venezuela with ex-Venezuelan military personnel and some US military, some ex-US military personnel. And of course, they were quickly captured, they were arrested, and the whole thing was an entire debacle. They became, as I said, sort of the laughing stock of the mercenary community. But the family members of the US mercenaries that are now currently in prison in Venezuela have said that they are of the opinion that their relatives would not have gone into Venezuela had they not had support from Washington. If we look at the history of the United States, and even, I mean, the current situation in terms of the number of personnel, the number of military bases within Colombia, and the number of former military officials that have defected, that are moving towards the border region, we are noticing a military buildup. Now, this, of course, is very similar to the Contra's activities in Nicaragua. If you know a little bit about your Latin American history, in 1979, there was a revolution in Nicaragua, and the former supporters of one of the most brutal regimes in Latin American history, they then moved to Honduras, which is a country with a major presence of US military bases. And they then, for the next 10 years, engaged in cross-border attacks on the Nicaraguan government and supporters of the Sandinistas, in particular attacking and murdering school teachers, doctors, and the whole objective was to bleed the Sandinista support dry, demoralize the population, and eventually, when the first elections were won by the Sandinistas in the early 1980s, but then when they held the second elections in, I think it was 1990, they lost. And they lost because of the fact that a lot of people were tired of the war. It wasn't that they had actually lost broad support by the population. So I think a similar strategy is being planned and possibly going to be carried out by the United States. Now, I think it's important to note why this, and I'm going to wrap up now. I think it's important to note why this hostility. Where does this hostility come from? I remember when President Chavez was in power, there were always critiques about his rhetoric. His rhetoric was too fiery, etc., etc. And yes, you can disagree with the delivery of particular speeches, but that wasn't really what the issue was about. I think the issue really was about the fact that it holds the largest strategic, or if not the largest, the second largest strategic oil reserves in the world, certainly in terms of heavy crude oil. And Venezuela openly challenged the United States. It openly challenged the United States in terms of promoting the idea that the state has to be responsible for creating an adequate healthcare system for the population. It is the state which has the responsibility to provide an adequate level of education for its citizens. The Venezuelan government, despite all of these problems and its internal contradictions and the harsh US economic sanctions, has built something like close to or just over 2 million homes in the last 20 years. And that's important. I've studied these programs. I originally commenced my interest in Venezuela in trying to understand whether these programs were actually taking place, whether they had support, whether they had adequate funding. And I'm going back to 2005. And I concluded that yes, the government was trying to match its political rhetoric. Now, on a regional basis, on a regional level, it supported several institutions, but I do want to note two, and one is the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, and CELAC. The Union of South American Nations is a body which was created with the support of Brazil when President Lula was in power in 2008, 2009. And it basically established a body where regional crisis, once a regional crisis took place, the presidents and the vice presidents or the representatives of the countries in South America would actually sit down and negotiate and discuss the crisis first before traveling to the Organization of American States, the famous OAS, which has supported basically almost every military coup in the history of modern history of Latin America, and of course where Washington has considerable influence and bullies regional diplomats as it sees fit. And there were several crises which UNASUR actually successfully issued declarations and almost put a halt or influenced the developments. I'm thinking of the developments in 2008, I think 2009 in Bolivia, where there was a section of, I think it was Santa Cruz, attempted to declare independence from the state of Bolivia. And really it was, again, another sort of soft coup d'etat taking place. The case with Rafael Correa in Ecuador, I think that date was 2010. And because the presidents and the representatives of South American countries would get together at these organizations first, discuss issues, and then issue a joint declaration, what it did is it put the United States in a very difficult position when they would sit down with all the presidents in the region at the Organization of American States, because these presidents would sit down first at UNASUR, discuss the issue a joint declaration. So it was almost presenting a unified, or trying to create a sort of a unified South American front before sitting down with the United States. Final point, of course, the Venezuelans and all the progressive and the leftists and the revolutionary forces in Venezuela do have a very rich tradition, which most people in the West are completely ignorant of. And of course, we have to stress the importance of Simón Bolívar. And Simón Bolívar was a political and military leader who in the early 1800s led and was crucial to the independence of many South American countries. And in my research, I discovered that issues were actually taking place even then between the United States and Venezuela. So Simón Bolívar declared that the United States seemed almost by providence destined to torment the Americas in the name of liberty and democracy. I'm roughly paraphrasing here. But if you study the diplomatic history, the United States, of course, was already intervening in affairs. They did not take a liking to Simón Bolívar. They did not take a liking to his ideas of creating a regional organization. They did not like his ideas of creating a greater unity amongst Latin American countries where we have many points in common. Of course, our colonial legacy from the Spanish, our language, our religion, our indigenous heritage, etc., etc. So the fact that the current movement in Venezuela is able to draw from this very rich tradition, I think is interesting, and will and should provide them with ammunition and ideas for future struggles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for that intervention. It was refreshing to hear you again on the history of U.S. interventions in Latin America since 1954, when the Marines went there and tried to extinguish the Guatemalan Spring.
Correct.
10 years of democratic government, progressive government. And in the case of Venezuela, not just having a socialist government, but a progressive socialist with massive or the largest oil reserves in the world. That is something that is not just because they're socialists, it is because they got oil. And like some of the spokespeople were saying, how is it possible that we're not making profit out of those oil reserves? How is it possible that we're not taking control of those oil reserves? And I would like to, before I invite Kat Busick to join us from the New Communist Party of Aotearoa, to acknowledge the presence this morning on this forum of the Australia-Venezuela Solidarity Network, AVSN. Noted here that we got Eulalia joining us from Brisbane and Sam Wainwright from Perth. I don't know if there is anyone else, but thank you for joining us in this effort in solidarity with the people of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and President Nicolás Maduro. So I would like to invite Kat to join us from the New Communist Party of Aotearoa. A big effort by the comrades across the Tasman in trying to rebuild the Communist Party over there, and always standing in solidarity with Venezuela as well. Comrade Kat, you got the floor.
Thanks, everyone. Comrade Diplomat Gaspari, Comrade Wiemer, Comrade Molina, friends, excuse me, friends and comrades. Thank you for being here today, and thank you also for inviting me to speak at this event hosted by Workers' Solidarity Western Australia. One of the positive sides of the pandemic, particularly since New Zealand has successfully controlled the outbreak, is that more meetings which may otherwise be held in trades halls or party office buildings are held on video conferencing platforms such as this one, which allow for greater international cooperation and this kind of collaborative meeting, which New Zealand normally finds it hard to participate in. On the topic of solidarity with the Communist Party of Venezuela is extremely important in this current period, because it is the Communist Party that must strengthen its position amongst the Venezuelan working people and take the leadership of the thorough and complete socialist transformation of Venezuela. Our view of the current political situation in Venezuela can be summarized briefly with a quote of Vladimir Lenin. In his article, The Impending Catastrophe and How to Combat It, Lenin described the situation in various countries such as the Bukhara People's Soviet Republic and the Mongolian People's Republic as, quote, not yet socialism, but a tremendous step towards socialism. During the course of the Bolivarian Revolution, we have seen Venezuela begin to take these steps, a revolutionary democratic process that has engaged with the working people of Venezuela and given them, both them and the political process of the era, a socialist orientation. When Chavez proclaimed that the Bolivarian Revolution was a socialist one in nature, and the process of forming the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, or PSUV, began, this highlighted the eternal hope for socialism that could not be extinguished after or by the changes in Moscow. The drive of the Bolivarian Revolution towards that better future, regardless of the at times unscientific conception of socialism it holds and its incredibly varied class nature, is testament to the great capacity of the working people of the world to resist imperialism and fight for a better socialist future. When we think of the history of world socialism, most comrades probably think of the Great October Socialist Revolution or the Chinese People's Revolution. Even in these countries, the process of revolution and the beginning of socialist economic and social change and revolution was drawn out and contradictory. But comrades not well versed in world history may not know the far more complicated and progressive nature of transition to socialism in other developing countries, such as Venezuela and historically things like South Yemen. The program of the NCPA towards a socialist Aotearoa is in its mention of Venezuela, which highlights its status as one of the most important global political situations of the present day. Towards a socialist Aotearoa contains the following paragraph. Socialist-oriented countries such as Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Nepal are also important subjects of solidarity as they face significant threats from the imperialist bloc while in a multi-class stage of possible transition into full socialist construction. The overthrow of the former socialist-oriented governments in Grenada, Ethiopia, Egypt, Burkina Faso, etc., either by direct US assault or by imperialist political intervention, led to a significant decline in living conditions, social welfare, and prosperity as they plunged back into neocolonialism. The new Communist Party of Aotearoa supports these movements towards socialism and their fight against imperialism, while reserving special solidarity for the proletarian elements within these movements who strengthen the role of Marxism-Leninism in their national scenario. The dual nature of this internationalist solidarity, both in support of pursued and also the efforts of the Communist Party to push and deepen the Bolivarian Revolution further, are based on Marxist-Leninist principles and are the common desire of the international communist movement. The fact that the resolution and solidarity with all of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, President Maduro, the Communist Party of Venezuela, and a further revolutionary solution to the crisis in Venezuela gained the support of over 70 international communist and workers' parties at the 21st International Meeting of Communist and Workers' Parties, hosted jointly by the Greek and Turkish parties late last year, highlights this consensus and this fact. For its part, the Communist Party of Venezuela has based its actions on a strong Marxist-Leninist bedrock, which has led to the strengthening of the alliance between Venezuelan socialists and communists for national liberation, and therefore also the Bolivarian Revolution as a whole. History has tragic examples of communist parties refusing to engage and talk to these kinds of socialist movements, or even taking up arms against these revolutionary democratic governments, with tragic consequences for social and political progress in these states. It is important to emphasize the incredible nature, despite its contradictions, of the Bolivarian Revolution and the contradictions also within its dominant conception of socialism. The successes that have been achieved by the Bolivarian Revolution are quite astounding. The constitutional and political rights for indigenous people, as well as the development of the communes and reform of Venezuela's state and electoral system, as Comrade Wiemer mentioned, have gone a long way to creating a new form of government in Venezuela, despite the progress still to go. There have been incredible socio-economic gains as well. 3 million free homes have been built in under 5 years for the Nación Grande de Venezuela. The social security system in Venezuela is so comprehensive that over 80% of Venezuelans receive food boxes under the local committees for supply and production, or CLAP. These achievements in Venezuela show that the socio-economic problems that we face, housing supply, child poverty and hunger, lack of indigenous rights, etc., are not immortal or inescapable. With a political program centered around working people with disregard to the profits of the monopolies, in other words, socialism, the people themselves can organize and build a better society. That is what terrifies the US government and the other monopolists so much. They are used to having dominance and dictatorship over all the Americas, and hence they lie about Venezuela in their newspapers and seek to reinstall imperialist dictatorship there, even stooping as low as stealing millions in gold and sending mercenaries in a sad imitation of the Bay of Pigs. Despite the fact that imperialism and neocolonialism have been discredited and defeated around the world, the monopolists never cease their strivings to subjugate the world beneath both their military boot and imperialist financial system. The tragic recent example of this was, of course, in Bolivia, where the years of socio-economic progress and development of genuine sovereignty, particularly for Bolivia's indigenous peoples, was reversed in November last year by a far-right and fundamentalist military coup, which has seen the privatization of nationalized resources, re-subjugation of workers and indigenous peoples, and a realignment of Bolivia towards the United States. Similar political paths of increased repression have occurred across the continent. The new Communist Party of Aotearoa this week signed an international appeal organized by the Bolivian movement towards socialism and an Italian party, Socialist Convergence, noting the illegal situation created by the de facto Army's government. We, together with communist and socialist groups around the world, openly stated our political backing for the movement towards socialism in Evo Morales as well as our intention to construct international mechanisms of solidarity and political support. We take these actions in the hope of restoring popular power in Venezuela, and also hope that we never have to take similar actions in the Venezuelan context. The New Zealand government, quite positively, refused to recognise Juan Guaido as usurper president like other Five Eyes nations and NATO-aligned countries did. Of course, the Ardern government cannot be said to support Maduro and socialist transition in Venezuela, just as the Conservative National Party government in power before the 2017 election did not either. Yet the NCPA views this refusal to recognise Guaido as a positive step for peaceful coexistence and a small level of independence for New Zealand from the US imperialist bloc. Verbal criticism is fine and to be expected from bourgeois governments. We communists support the continued relations between the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and New Zealand based on peaceful coexistence, and will maintain our organised opposition to efforts here in New Zealand to push Aotearoa more into line with what Washington expects from its subordinate states and what we see practiced in Australia. The NCPA wishes the Communist Party of Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution the best of success. We are well aware of the at times complicated relationship between the Communist Party and the other United Socialist Forces, but we hope that these differences are simply part of the resolution of contradictions within the Bolivarian revolutionary process that will end up with greater unity and further revolutionary transformation of Venezuela. Viva Venezuela, viva el socialismo, abajo el imperialismo. Thank you.
Viva. Thank you, Comrade Kat, for that intervention. Well received. You know, I've got another memory that came to my mind. In 2018, I had the opportunity, thanks to the invitation by the Venezuelan embassy in Canberra and Daniel Gaspari, to attend the election, the presidential elections in May 2018. And what we witnessed there as observers was the freedom that the people had to elect the president. And we were taken to several of the barrios in places where it was like a big party outside the electoral booth, where Maduro was elected democratically as the president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The participation of the people, that was very important for the observers to witness. And I was privileged enough to travel back in January before the pandemic. And again, you can see the way that the Bolivarian Revolution had been able to overcome obstacle after obstacle by going back to the people. The need to deepen that revolution, which is part of the defense of the revolution. The deeper, the more workers' power that is exercised for the survival of the Bolivarian Revolution. The next speaker is Seamus Carey. He is an executive member of the Communist Party of Australia in WA, and has recently written several articles in the Workers' Weekly, The Guardian, in relation to Venezuela, and had been studying the Bolivarian Revolution, and have some interesting views on how to defend the revolution and how to strengthen the solidarity movement. So I would like to welcome Seamus. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade. I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm joining this meeting from the land of the Whadjuk Noongar Boodja and pay my respects to its elders, past, present, and emerging. The Communist Party of Australia has been very active in the Venezuelan solidarity movement in Australia, and we firmly support the Bolivarian Revolution and the leadership of President Maduro, and oppose the US aggression against Venezuela in all its forms, whether it be the sanctions, threats of military intervention, political bullying, intimidation. And Yet the US claims it does all this for the benefit of the people. And it's frankly shocking how many people in our country seem to accept this when we all know what the Trump administration thinks of Latin American people. But the problem is, in Australia, we do not have a genuine discussion in our media. It's all controlled by monopolies with a set agenda following the US line always. In this time, the socialist and socialist-oriented countries around the world have proven that what the world needs is cooperation, both international cooperation and cooperation within a country, within a society, specifically to combat this pandemic situation, but also to combat the problems that we are facing as a world and individually in our societies. And these countries have been providing an excellent example of a way forward. However, the so-called bastions of freedom and democracy around the world have shown the opposite of this. They've shown they care nothing for cooperation or for whether it be international or within a society. We've seen the abject failure of the US to deal with its own coronavirus outbreak. And the US is not only destroying itself through its failure to manage the crisis, it also is insisting that it should fail everywhere else as well. Because the fact that they have, against the advice, the pleas of many, many countries, governments around the world, they have persisted in their sanctions, unilateral sanctions against Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, many countries. Sanctions which specifically, amongst many other things, target healthcare resources, medicines, and food, which are all things that we know there are shortages of. So when they set about telling a country where we already know there have been shortages of food and medicine because of the existing blockade, in a crisis where this is needed more than ever and where people are dying because of this, they insist upon continuing with those sanctions, and in many cases even strengthening them. That causes deaths. That can only cause people to die. And the US shows by this policy that it considers that to be a legitimate way to conduct itself in the international arena in order to pressure political change in other countries. This is disgusting, and yet it is taken as a given. This is the way the world works, apparently, but we do not accept this. Venezuelan people have shown they do not accept this, and the Bolivarian Revolution is a great, bright light of hope that the people around the world will not put up with this forever, will not put up with American violence against all the people of the world simply to pursue their own enrichment. So this is why we consider the situation in Venezuela to be very relevant to Australia, very relevant to all the people of the world. Firstly, of course, we care for the people. Although they are a long way away from us, we operate in the party, we operate on the principle of proletarian internationalism, and we see us all as part of the same struggle for the rights of the working people, for a better future for the working people. And we see them suffering due to American hostility towards this country, which is taking its own path. It is not accepting the dictates of another country as to how it should run its affairs. But that country, that imperialist power, the US, treats it with violence, with hostility, and with intentional harm to the people. That in itself, that simple compassion for the people is a good enough reason for us to support them. That would be wholly sufficient. But we have further reasons relevant to us, relevant to the struggle of the Australian people, because the Australian people too need to engage in the same struggle to achieve the independence of our country, because we too, like the Venezuela of the days before the Bolivarian Revolution began, we are under US political, economic, military subjugation. Now, we are lucky enough that we're in a fortunate position where the ill effects of this domination are not so obvious in everyday life. But the moment we try to rid ourselves of this influence and become truly independent, we will see the same sorts of policies being applied to us by the US regime as they have to Venezuela, as they have to Cuba, as they have to TPR Korea, to the Soviet Union. I could go on and on and on. Every country which resists US imperial dominance, which seeks its own independence politically and economically, faces this same pattern of hostility, of attempted or successful intervention, overthrow of their legitimate governments, and have a right-wing government forced upon them. Independence. We in Australia don't always understand the full importance of independence because we have never been an independent country so far, and we have accepted what lack of independence is like. We have also benefited from our own position as a minor imperial power, which is another factor impeding the ideological development of the Australian people towards understanding of this principle of independence and its importance. And this is another reason why both we are engaged in subjugation of other peoples around the world, for instance, economic activities in many African countries, in the Philippines, East Timor, which we never hear about, but which are going on. We benefit from this. And furthermore, we are completely dominated by US interests and US control of our politics and media. So for both these reasons, the concept of independence isn't really one which, pardon me, which the Australian people are too familiar with, sadly. But here is the main point. There is no such thing as democracy without independence. If your country, if your government is going to put the dictates of another country ahead of its own people's interest, then how can that be in any sense democracy? It cannot. So you cannot even speak about democracy until you speak about independence. But yet what we see is every country which struggles for its independence from US or other imperialism is portrayed as an enemy of democracy. And instead the US is portrayed as the hero of the struggle for democracy, despite all the evidence to the contrary. But what we are dealing with here is not a question of facts, it is a question of propaganda by the imperialists. So the Venezuelan revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, is of incredible significance to the world struggle for independence, for socialism, for a better world for the working people. And it's vitally important that we see in that struggle our future in Australia to struggle for that same better world for the working people of Australia and all oppressed people. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Seamus. And Family Union Solidarity WI, Worker Solidarity WI, and the Communist Party of Australia family stands in solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution and its legitimate president. And we condemn the position adopted by the Australian government in recognizing White Dog as the interim president, or whatever his adopted name is. And we need to continue to campaign in Australia, all our groups, for the government of Australia to change that policy. We need to start working towards strengthening the solidarity movement, ensuring that the Australian government adopts a more independent foreign policy. Excuse me. Before we get into a Q&A, a short Q&A, I would like to acknowledge we also got in the room Comrade Andrew Irving, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Australia. Thank you, Comrade, for joining us from Melbourne. And he posted something on the chat room. On Monday, the 27th of July, the Cuban Solidarity Campaign in the UK, we organized a celebration of the 60 years of that inspiring internationalism with the Cuban Revolution, with a number of good speakers, among them Fernando Gonzalez, one of the Cuban Five and hero of the Cuban Revolution, joining by Jeremy Corbyn. We're gonna discuss that event here in Australia. Also, there will be some events hosted by the Australia-Cuba Friendship Society. So I would like to welcome now questions. If people want to say a few words, please just indicate. There is a little hand down there that you could use or indicate. I will invite at the end for those who wish to participate to turn your cameras on so we can take a photo of this event. But there is one question from Aline Whitehead. So what is the answer? Perhaps an international body similar to the United Nations, but for socialist countries, starting with a global opposition to nuclear weapons. That is a question there. Don't know who the speakers would like to answer that question. Comrade Seamus?
I think perhaps it's a difficult one, of course. There's no easy answer. But what we are seeing is struggles around the world in different countries to achieve independence, to achieve sovereignty, and achieve a better society. To achieve governments which act in respect of the sovereignty and independence of others and act on the basis of mutual benefit and cooperation. And this is not something that you can force on a country from the outside. It would sort of negate the purpose. So rather, we can only count on the fact that this movement will persist around the world. The conditions will arise for people to take up this struggle. I think perhaps the suggestion of an international body for socialist countries, I think it would be a shame, it would be difficult to do that, because what we don't want, although it is what is happening, is this division of the world into two camps to re-emerge. So I think what you see a lot of socialist countries doing is appealing to the UN as something to be further developed and advanced as a vehicle for international cooperation rather than the dominance of a few powers. So there's no easy answers, but we need movements by the people around the world, which is what we are seeing in many places, including Venezuela. Another reason why it's such a beacon of hope for all of us. And it is good to see many countries insisting upon more equality and fairness in international relations. More and more governments and countries, people are getting fed up with US bullying. So hopefully we see more of a shift in that direction.
Thank you, Comrade. Seamus, anyone else want to add to that from the speakers?
I think in the past, there have been many different forms of cooperation between both the international communist movement as a whole and also the world socialist system in whichever form it exists. You may recall originally before World War II, there was the Communist International, which was dissolved by pretty much everyone's agreement in 1943 because the different international situation meant that parties needed to be able to be more independent and more nationally capable as they matured and the situation developed. And since then, have been different models. Of course, the Inform Bureau in the late 1940s, which did the exchange between different both ruling and non-ruling communist parties in Europe, and during the period of the existence of the people's democracies in Eastern Europe, there were organizations such as the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance and the Warsaw Treaty Organization, which allowed them to have a much more united front than we see today. But there were significant problems with some of these organizations, which led to disagreements and splits within the international communist movement that could have possibly been ignored, also been avoided. I think that today there is significant bilateral cooperation between socialist countries and also multilateral where appropriate, as well as annual exchange of views and cooperation within the international meetings of communist and workers' parties. So there is still definitely that cooperation that exists today, and especially in the fields of peace and anti-nuclear cooperation. But as Seamus pointed out, I think in some ways it's quite good that there isn't that binary division of the world, because it actually allows for greater peace efforts and greater cooperation, but we can still see these kinds of mutual cooperation between the socialist states that also allow for more independence and more national independence and kind of sovereignty than existed at times in the 20th century. That's just my 2 cents in the matter.
Thank you, Comrade Kat. I hope that answers the question from Aline. There is a question on the chat from Chris Warren. Then we're gonna allow Comrade Sam. We ask a question live to Comrade Carolus. But the question on the chat at the moment is Eva Gollingham, who is a journalist, has written that the US organization National Endowment for Democracy interfered in elections in the past in breach of Venezuelan law. Is this a problem for the December elections? Maybe Comrade Carolus could answer that question.
Okay, now, thank you. First, thank you for this intervention. It's very interesting to hear and to learn from you. From Rodrigo Acuna, he made a very good summary, and I hope we can be in touch in the future. with all your investigations, also the possibility to hear in the future to speak with Comrade Kat from the new Communist Party of our Tirol. It's and also von Seamus. The typical in, as you told, I think that for the United States there is no law. They openly can say we do not obey ningún law, as also she left all the international organizations where there are accusations against the United States. And it's really an imperialist power. It's a dangerous power. We also in Venezuela are discussing it because often it's really, we speak of the crisis of capitalism, but it does not mean, and you can see it in the case of Venezuela, that it's no possibility or to make great damage. And also this imperialist powers have today the possibility to destroy the world, the nature, everything. For that, it's very important that we understand the most of the population also in Venezuela is in danger because daily mass media telling laws, how do you say, lies, telling lies million of times. It creates doubts. In this moment in Venezuela, we are seeing it daily. For example, with the coronavirus, a lot of medias do not inform. They create fear. And of course, also they normally say the only guilty is the government. In our case, the only guilty is the President Maduro. For that, all these international laws, also international organizations, treaties of civilizations are not accepted by the United States government. And for that, I told that we will have elections in December. And they say we do not accept the elections because the elections will not give the result we wanted to have. And for that, we say, especially the work with the young people, with the youth, is very important. In Venezuela, we often speak the elder generation of the time of Chavez. We speak of the Fourth Republic, the Venezuela before Chavez. For people who have now 18 years, they go for the first time to the election. All these stories are very important to know, but of course not. They are not convincing. For that, the education, also the political education, the ideological education with the youth is very important. That can, in order they can make difference between the reality, between the truth and the lies. And once more, we cannot hope, and also in Venezuela, the opposition, the greatest majority of the opposition, as you see, Guaido, he should be in prison. He he is now, and every moment, every possibility that he could, the people will have justice with Guaido, it would be a scandal worldwide, because it means dictatorship in Venezuela, the dictator Maduro cut all the liberties. For that, as I said in my first introduction, it's we see the revolutionary politics. It's really a science. The combination of tactic and strategic is very important. Not only what you want to do in the moment, but also the international correlation, the power relationship is very important. And for that is very important also the international solidarity and the international unity and the possibility to discuss with other parties, with other scientifics and personalities, the possible solutions, also in the case of Venezuela. We see it in Venezuela. We have the idea of a national liberation struggle. I think it's the most important thing in the moment the independence, the sovereignty is not guaranteed in Venezuela. Years ago, we thought we are free, as told also Seamus in the case of Australia. We have democracy, we have freedom, and we see in the case of Venezuela, when the people really want freedom, liberty, freedom, sovereignty, then the US imperialism and also Europe, in our case, also Europe, intervene immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Carolus, for that response. We got Sam Wainwright from Socialist Alliance in the Australian Venezuelan Solidarity Network. We go live to ask a question. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vinny. Yeah, a question to you, Carolus. We see at the moment the United States trying to take advantage of the low oil prices in concert with a crippling economic blockade, really trying to cripple Venezuela. And I'm wondering if you can, I mean, it seems to me that both creates the need to deepen the revolution in response, but also creates very specific obstacles to doing that because of loss of access to markets, currency with which to buy new equipment, all that kind of thing. And I'm wondering, in the current circumstance in Venezuela, can you explain the extent to which Venezuela has been able to both develop self-sufficiency in food production and perhaps other areas of economic activity, and secondly, whether it has been able to advance workers' control and workers' participation in the production process in more enterprises?
Thank you, Sam. Comrade Carolus?
Okay, it's very important questions because we are discussing them daily. First is I spoke about it in the introduction. Also, we see it's really a class struggle behind it in two ways. First, the international class struggle, that is imperialism against sovereign national states. It's the first, we say, the principal contradiction. and it needs a lot of unity of all the people in Venezuela to avoid a direct war confrontation. We see it in other countries, especially in the Near East, that a war would destroy, would make it impossible all these very important discussions we need, and finding also solutions. For that, we have to fight for peace. We have to fight against war. We have to fight also or look for international cooperation to avoid a direct aggression, war aggression against Venezuela. But also, of course, we are living daily aggressions. We are speaking of multifaceted aggressions, financial aggressions, economic aggressions, and now it's cyber war. We read that the United States tried to have a special military base in Guyana to near Venezuela to make cyber wars. There is a blockade, not a total blockade, but they can do it in the coast of Venezuela. For that, this principle contradiction is very important to resolve. But at the same time, we must see the fundamental contradiction between capital and work. We also recognize in Venezuela that not everything wrong is made by the imperialists. There are also important mistakes, faults inside the country. Especially there are class interests inside. They make it sometimes difficult to make changes in the economic politics. For example, during 100 years, the sector of the economic sector, the bourgeois sector, which dominated the export-import, are ruling the economy. For that, with this sector of the bourgeois sector in power, they are not interested in production. They are not interested in to improve the agriculture. They are interested in export and import. It's easy money. It's and of course we are fighting in Venezuela, and we say we need for this the working class to really control the production. The Communist Party of Venezuela calls for the control of the production by the working class, the control of the agriculture by the peasants. And this are very bloody class struggle in the moment in Venezuela. You can say, especially in the agriculture sector, there are daily struggles. There are murders of peasants who are defending the constitution, the Bolivarian constitution, which gives them the right to have right for land and to have the right to make agriculture production. For that, we must understand it's also very important for the international solidarity that sometimes they wanted to see a perfect revolution. Often they think about socialism in Venezuela. No, we are saying there's no socialism in Venezuela. It's very important because this crisis in Venezuela, and there is a crisis, is a capitalist crisis. Of course, Donald Trump and other right-wing politics, they use it. They say this is a socialism. It failed once more. No, we have to respond. In Venezuela, there is a capitalism, but there's a fight for socialism. There's a fight also, a political, ideological fight for socialism, and of course, the real situation will be decided in the position of the workers of the production. The control of the production, of the economic production, will be the decision, and this fight we have to do. For that, there will no illusions in the next years in Venezuela. The United States will use all the means to destroy this fantastic political process in Venezuela, with mistakes, with errors, faults, but also with great advantages, as Dr. Rodrigo Acuña talk about it. And for that, we must prepare us in all these areas. Of course, we have a peace movement, but also we say we must be capable to defend our country. And for that, I spoke shortly about the civil military unity. You cannot find it in other Latin American countries, without Cuba, of course, and Nicaragua. It's a very important victory. The USA are trying to destroy this civil military unity. It's not perfect, but it's in the moment, it makes it possible to defend our country. And of course, also it's very important, the international solidarity. And also they try to, the enemy tries to use not so important things, maybe mistakes or wrong concepts or wrong decisions to divide us. And I remember when Chavez was president, and okay, you know, he spoke long and often, and once when there was a discussion of nuclear power, of nuclear energy. It exists in Latin America, in Mexico, in Argentina, in Brazil, the nuclear reactors. Also, Chavez said we cannot burn all the energy. It's against ecology. And they spoke also about the nuclear energy. And of course, immediately there came the news, the fake news that Chavez wanted to build a nuclear bomb. And I remember one organization, in a European organization, immediately say we will stop international solidarity because we are against the nuclear bomb of Chavez. For that, we have to be careful with our declarations, with our words. And finally, I repeat understand there are two contradictions to solve. the defending of the sovereignty, independency, but also to go forward in the class struggle in Venezuela to achieve finally socialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolus, for your response. We got two questions waiting for us on the chat, one from Diego, one from Arisa Jael, and we got Andrew Irvin from Melbourne, General Secretary of the CPA. He will join us live with a question to Comrade Carolus. Comrade Andrew, the floor is yours.
Carolus, it's great to see you again. It's a few years since you were over here, but I was promoting this event because I know how insightful your contribution and your party's contribution is to talking about the situation in Latin America as well as in Venezuela. So it's great to see you again. Just a question. I know that you could probably talk for quite a period about the situation in Latin America and South America with the changes that have been taking place. But one of the big issues is the situation in Bolivia and with Comrade Evo. I'm just wondering what the situation is and what solidarity is getting from other countries and organisations within Latin America.
Thank you, Comrade Andrew. Comrade Carolus?
I didn't understand everything, every word, but I tried to respond. There's a great discussion also in the left, and I hope it will be a worldwide discussion. Can you go to socialism by reforms? It's an old discussion from the last century, and it continues. It's sufficient to gain the election. It's sufficient as it happened in Ecuador and Argentina and Brazil, and also in Venezuela. We see there's the great decision for the political struggle to gain the power, not only the how do you say, not only the government, not only the parliament, but also the control of the economic. In this moment, the bourgeois class in Venezuela demonstrates who has the real power. They stop the production in the industry, they stop the production in the agriculture, and also, and the whole system is in crisis in Venezuela. For that, we say it's necessary as soon as possible to have workers' control, to have a peasant control, to really also as a state control the economics, also to fight against corruption, against bureaucracy, against inefficiency. These are present, and these are enemies of the political decisions, and also these are enemies for the people, because the people have a daily suffering, and the consciousness, the political consciousness, the anti-imperialist consciousness we spoke about, it's okay, it exists, but if there are no solutions, economic solutions, political solutions, it also this majority, it exists in Venezuela against the US aggressions, it can be failing, as we saw it in the elections in Brazil, in Ecuador, in Argentina, for example. For that, I'm very interested also in this video conference, because I see the necessity to speak together, to come together, and also to discuss together real solutions. Solutions, as I told, tactical, immediate solutions. Sometimes also in Venezuela, we're speaking about the socialism. Finally, the solutions coming with the socialism. It's right. But of course, there are daily necessities of the people, of the workers. In the moment, there's no solution visible that the workers are earning $4 monthly. That the the elder persons are receiving $2 monthly, and you need, for a normal life, a family life in Venezuela, $100 or $200. Of course, in the moment the government tries to help, we recognize it. It's not in all the troubles and all the critics. It's not the same the case of Venezuela and the case of Bolivia, for example. Here the government is trying to find solutions, but they have, in the moment, they do not have the control. And this is the problem. Now we received, as you know, I'm sure, gasoline from Iran last month. Okay, now in the next weeks, all this gasoline is consumed. There will be no new gasoline. And what to do? And for that, we have to find revolutionary solutions, and this can come from international cooperation solidarity. Difference from the past, no country or no organization or party can decide what to do in another country, but very important to exchange experiences, to exchange opinions, and also to make economic cooperation. The USA will go forward to, as Elliot Abrams said, to the people in Venezuela will suffer hunger and will die. They will try to stop every importation of food, every importation of gasoline, every importation for everything. It's not so easy because our new powers in the world, they have to respect and accept. But finally, also our party says we must find solution in the country. And also a very important thing is we have to tell the truth. And sometimes in politics, also left governments do not lie, but they are thinking not to tell the truth is better. And we have to tell the truth to the people. We had always a very good example in Fidel Castro. They make mistakes, but they recognize it and they spoke directly with the people. And we have to do it also in our political processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Carolus. And now, Comrade Rodrigo, we add to the issue on Bolivia, but we're reaching this critical time where time is pressing. So we got 2 more questions on the chat, and we have 5 minutes before we wrap up. So 2-minute answers, please, Comrade Rodrigo.
I will be super brief. Regarding the situation in Bolivia, the elections which were to be held in the next month or so have now been delayed. So that's the 3rd time that the elections have been delayed in Bolivia. And I think it's clear the reason is because the government, which came to power through a coup d'etat, understands that they will probably lose the elections. There is serious repression taking place in Bolivia against mass supporters. There have been demonstrations regarding the situation with the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. And a lot of this information is simply just not making it into the mainstream press as expected. It's only been covered by independent journalists, progressive, left-wing, critical, radical thinkers, etc., etc. The majority of the media just doesn't even care. In terms of the situation, or I guess a reflection in the future, I think that unfortunately, in the case of Latin America, and this was proven in Bolivia, unless the armed forces are democratized, then left-wing progressive governments are always going to be faced with a crucial situation that once they attempt to implement a reformist, a serious reformist program, or a revolutionary program, or a program, label it however you want to label it, but essentially that's going to challenge big capital and is going to support the working class, the peasant class, the broader sort of middle progressive classes in the society. The military is always going to be there, active, ready, on standby to carry out a coup d'etat. Now, the coup d'etat that was carried out in Bolivia was not the one that was carried out in Chile in 1973, or in other cases in Latin America. The coup d'etats that we have seen carried out in the last decade or so in Latin America are much softer. They try and mobilize just the essential amount of troops necessary. They try and issue as many threats as possible. They try and have an aeroplane on standby to get the president out of the country, like was the case in Honduras with Zelaya. So, but the point is that they still, the Latin American elite are still willing to carry out coup d'etats when they perceive that their economic and political interests are at stake or are at risk. So I think that in future, that is a point that progressive sectors are just going to have to demand, even if it takes decades, that the military institutions need to be democratized. They should not be, it should not be a situation where the higher ranks of the military already have their own academies, which the elites are going to send their children to anyway. And I think Venezuela, if you study the history of Venezuela, it was actually one of the exceptions in Latin America. And that's why someone like Hugo Chavez and many of his colleagues were able to rise amongst the ranks. It's because the military was actually democratized to some extent in the 1970s. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And as I mentioned, it's this critical time at the moment. We need to wrap up. The question on the chat is, how would you explain the 2019 Venezuelan protest and a state reaction to it? To those who only saw mainstream media coverage of the events. And the second question, Assad is a valued anti-imperialist or a very tolerable monster? So if people can give an answer in 2 minutes, will we be able to deal with this, which is very difficult. I don't know if anybody wants to.
I'm happy to make a super brief comment. I've covered the those protests. Again, do a little bit of reading on Latin American history. Do a little bit of reading on Chilean history. When these protests take place, yes, the opposition is able to at times garner broader support. But when you're looking at the sort of the violent explosion, the violence, in many cases, these are people that are criminal elements, are from the sort of the poorest sections of Venezuelan society. They're paid. They are not simply engaging in peaceful protest, but they're organizing to attack members of the security forces. And it is a strategy by the political right in Venezuela to destabilize the country, to create an image of the police forces engaging in mass repression. You cannot compare the police forces and the military forces in Venezuela, which, of course, you know, no country has a perfect record on human rights, but there is no direct state policy, to my knowledge, in Venezuela to quell dissent. It just doesn't compare. You cannot compare the reaction of Carabineros de Chile in Chile and the Chilean military under the Piñera administration towards protest, the way that they've handled massive protest against neoliberal economic policies in Chile, to the protests that have taken place in Venezuela. There's a very clear objective on the political right in Venezuela. They play the parliamentary democratic game when they think they can win seats in Congress, and when they don't think they can, they scream blue murder, and they attempt to destabilize the country by trying to pay off members of the armed forces, by paying thug criminal elements in the barrios to carry out attacks. And I mean, this doesn't get enough coverage, anywhere near enough coverage in the Western press. Attacks on the maternity ward of a hospital in Venezuela, burning down a house, I think the house where Hugo Chavez was born. These are really, you know, almost terrorist attacks. They are very similar to what was taking place in Nicaragua in the 1990s with the Contras, attempting to create a situation of destabilization and painting the government as a repressive force.
Thank you, Rodrigo. That is what time allowed us to do this morning. It has been a very interesting discussion. I would like to acknowledge Lara, who's put it here on the chat. Greetings from the sovereign Idingi government and my clans on the Gurundara and Gamri territory. These two are sovereign and ceded territories under colonial occupation. Great to see you all here, especially Dr. Wiemer, Comrade Daniel, the embassy, and our Peruvian neighbors. As indigenous and First Nations peoples, we stand strong with you against colonial oppression and belligerence. We stand in solidarity with you people and with the constitutional rule of President Maduro and the sovereignty of Venezuela. We denounce the fake recognition to global imperialists, preferred candidate, and demand respect for Venezuelans' sovereignty, no war for oil, hands off Venezuela. Thank you, Vinny, and the speakers for today's important update, Venceremos. Comrades, I would like to invite you all to turn your cameras on so our tech guru can take photographs of the event. And I think that we have learned some important lessons. There is no shortcuts to socialism, and we must defend the Bolivarian Revolution while strengthening workers' power to take control of the working class, by the working class and the peasantry of the production, to eliminate the crisis of capitalism that capitalism has created in the Bolivarian Revolution. With this, I think that Zach is ready for the photographs. I would like to thank you all to joining us this morning. It has been an interesting effort, but the pandemic has also given us the opportunity by the new technology to join forces and invite people from overseas. Thank you very much, Comrade Carolus. Thank you very much, Comrade Kat, for joining us from your respective countries. Thank you to Comrade Rodrigo for joining us from Sydney, and Comrade Seamus from Perth, and all the others that have joined us this morning. Venceremos. We stand united in defense of the Bolivarian Revolution. Thank you. All the best. Stay safe.
Thanks everyone. I've stopped streaming.